After almost a decade of unmitigated successes across the Middle East, Iran's regional proxy militias have suffered a serious setback these past months. Thanks for joining me again for another All Israel News update. I'm Hanan Lishinsky, and this time I'll try to give you an overview of the Iranian so-called axis of resistance, all the groups in it, and how they have suffered a serious setback during these past couple of months, and that is actually one of the most important outcomes of Israel's wars, both in Gaza, in Lebanon, its actions in Syria, and also in Yemen, and we'll get into all of this. Now, when we're talking about the danger posed by the Iranian regime, especially in the West, we're often talking about the nuclear threat, Iran's plan to develop nuclear power and then get to a nuclear bomb. And all of this is, of course, important, and it's critical because this is, of course, the most dangerous potential development. But what has been not really understood in the West, often when I talk to people who are not from Israel, is that the Iranian regime has, over the past decade, built a huge network, a regional network that spans across the whole Middle East, that threatens not just Israel, but Western interests, especially the US military bases across the region, and really aims to enable it, on the one hand, to defend its nuclear program as it continues to develop its nuclear weapons, but on the other hand, to provide the Iranian regime with a doomsday weapon, with another doomsday weapon really next to the nuclear weapons, that it can aim at Israel and try to destroy Israel. The base of this network is the Iranian regime's Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and especially its Quds Force, which is a unit, a secret covert unit that is tasked especially with developing this network and with operating outside of Iran. Now, when the Iranian regime was founded at the end of the 70s, remember, it was a revolutionary regime. This is a revolutionary movement, and from the beginning this regime has sought to export its ideology and really continue its revolution. This is somewhat similar to, for example, the communist movement, which also worked over time to export this revolution and this ideology across the world. Now the Iranian regime, in a somewhat smaller scale, is working in the same way. It's turning especially to Shia populations across the Middle East. So the Muslim population is mainly divided between a majority Sunni population and a smaller minority Shia population. And the Iranian regime ideology is a Shia Muslim revolutionary ideology. So the IRGC and the Quds Force have, from the beginning, from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, have always worked to strengthen relations with Shia Muslim communities across the Middle East. They exist in almost every country. Not in Israel, by the way, which is an interesting little fact. But they have worked from the beginning to establish relations and then establish terror cells, armed groups, fund, train, equip those armed groups. And the outcome of this is what we see today across the Middle East. Now, as I mentioned, the Iranian regime calls this its axis of resistance. And the resistance here is aimed against this huge array of enemies that it sees, which is led by the US. So we're always talking about Iran and Israel, but really the big enemy, there's this phrase that is often being used, the big Satan, is the US, and this is true also for Iran. Iran sees the US as its big enemy, but Israel here is the nearer, maybe the smaller enemy, but this is, of course, where most of its energies are focused at the moment. So this axis of resistance is aimed at countering what Iran sees as the influence of the US and of Israel and all of their Western allies. So remember that Iran and Iran-backed forces have also carried out terror attacks across the world, in Argentina in the 80s, also against French troops here in the region. So everything that is seen as the West is the enemy, and this is what this axis of resistance is aimed against. Now let's look at who is in the axis of resistance. And first of all, what is often being described as the crown jewel is Hezbollah, the party of God, as its name says in Arabic. Hezbollah was one of the first of these proxy groups that Iran built. This was easy to do for Iran, for the IRGC and the Quds Force which helped establish Hezbollah. because Lebanon has a huge formerly minority population. There are estimates of Shia Muslims, excuse me, there are estimates that the Shia population by now might be more than 50% of Lebanon, but this is a whole other issue that I won't get into here. But Hezbollah, especially before the current war, was the largest, the best funded, the best trained and equipped of those proxy militia forces that Iran has built across the region. Now, apart from Hezbollah, in Syria there are several groups, some of which aren't even native to Syria, or I think most of them even are not native to Syria. So when the Syrian civil war started, this war that just received this new push in the last couple of days, the war started almost 10 years ago, and when it started, the Assad regime was already closely connected with Iran, and Iran used some of its proxy forces, threw them into Syria to help the Assad regime stabilize and almost beat these rebel jihadi Islamist groups and almost win the war. But as we saw in the last couple of days, this didn't work out in the end. So over the past decade, Syria really became a battleground, a testing ground for all of these Iranian groups. So just because I'm saying all of these, I'll just list a couple of them. There are Pakistani groups of Pakistani Shia Muslims. There are groups, militias made up of Afghani from Afghanistan, Shia Muslims. There are many groups from Iraq. Some of them have, there is an Iraqi Hezbollah group. And also I recently wrote an article explaining the situation in Iraq, which you can click here and read more about this array of Iranian-backed forces in Iraq. But anyway, the IRGC really coordinated and facilitated the entry of a lot of these groups into Iraq, where they gained valuable experience in fighting these Sunni rebel groups. So for example, Hezbollah also really turned the tide in the civil war, and in effect, in the progress, really gained battle group experience, which in turn, before Israel entered into Lebanon, there was a lot of talk here in Israel. A lot of experts were really afraid that these battle-hardened Hezbollah terrorists would really give the IDF fits if it decided to go into Lebanon. Thank God this didn't happen, but this was a major concern before the IDF entered Lebanon. So just to complete this list of groups and places where the IRGC has established its proxy militias and keeps funding and backing them, we must of course mention Yemen, which really flew under the radar for most people before the current war here in Israel. But these Houthi rebels, they're again a Shia kind of community really. They were a kind of a tribe, the Houthi family. They're a kind of splinter sect within Shia Islam. If you're interested, read about it. It's fascinating stuff. But anyway, this Houthi militia took over large parts of Yemen and is now governing these parts, and all the time shooting rockets, missiles, drones at Israel. Just 2 days ago was the latest example, where rocket alerts were activated here where we stand in the surrounding areas for the first time in months. So the Houthis also continue to attack Israel, and despite the ceasefire that was signed by Hezbollah, all of these other axis of resistance forces have declared that they will continue to attack Israel, and we've indeed seen attacks from Yemen and from Iran in the last couple of days, not to mention that Hezbollah also really hasn't kept to the ceasefire. So taking a step back, now that we've established where several of these groups are operating, the Iranian regime, the IRGC, has really invested in creating a true network here. All of these groups are connected. Some of them have war rooms, joint situation rooms where they coordinate their actions, especially against Israel. In the last decade, as I mentioned, Iran really has invested millions, billions of dollars probably, in smuggling weapons, equipping all of these actors with advanced, especially with its advanced drone technology. Now, I'm saying advanced because it's relatively new, but these are very simple drones for the most part, quickly and cheaply produced drones that can nevertheless strike, are very effective in combat. And so they've been equipping all of these groups with weapons. For example, Hezbollah has even received very advanced anti-ship weapons, anti-aircraft weapons. All of this didn't help, but it's important to understand that this is what caused the Israeli public to be really afraid of another Lebanon war. Another very important investment by Iran was the establishment of these smuggling routes, these smuggling corridors that really go all throughout the Middle East. They've established routes to supply the Yemeni Houthi rebels, for example, by water. But most importantly, there is a land corridor of several routes leading from Iran through through areas secured by its Iraqi militias, over into Syria through areas secured by its Syrian-based militias, and then from Syria through the desert, through dusty roads in the desert, all the way to the sea and to Lebanon, which lies on the coast. And this is where all of these advanced weapons reached Hezbollah. So there really is a road network, a smuggling network. This is also being used, by the way, to smuggle drugs. So the Assad regime is one of the main peddlers and enablers of a huge trade in Captagon pills, which is one of the main ways this regime earns its money at the moment. And this is also being used to smuggle weapons, to buy weapons, to sell weapons. So again, this axis of resistance that Iran has built is a multi-million, billion-dollar project spanning across the region. And we'll now get into what happened in the last couple of months. So just let's say 1 year ago, Iran was really at the head of this vast network, which gave it routes to reach the sea, to reach the Mediterranean. It gave it multiple angles of intelligence on Israel and across the whole region, on US positions in Iraq and Syria, and so on. But then October 7 happened. And we still don't really know the extent of the involvement of the Iranian regime in October 7. It seems that Hamas leader Sinwar decided to embark on the October 7 invasion without telling everyone else in this network. Apparently Hezbollah was surprised by the whole attack, and the regime as well. So the Iranian regime didn't really decide on October 7, but everything that happened afterward really harmed this network and leaves it in a position where today it's almost back to square zero. Now, if we're looking at the October 7 war, specifically in the Gaza Strip, leaving aside everything else, Hamas at the moment is almost destroyed, as well as the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another terror group that was backed by Iran in the Gaza Strip. So the Gaza Strip is almost completely destroyed. Hamas it still exists, the hostages are still there. But if we're looking at this just from the perspective of the of the Iranian axis of resistance, the Gaza Strip for now is really taken out of this. There are Israeli troops there on the ground, and Iran for the moment can really forget about any influence it had in the Gaza Strip. A similar situation now occurred in Lebanon, of course. Hezbollah throughout the war was very successful in keeping Israel busy, firing rockets, drones, and everything else at Israel throughout the war. But the second that Israel really began to be serious about destroying Hezbollah, it killed off almost its complete leadership. It dismantled all of the infrastructure that was set in place for a huge invasion of northern Israel. So Sinwar and his plan to invade southern Israel, this was taken from an earlier existing plan of the Hezbollah's elite Radwan force to invade northern Israel. So they had huge weapon depots in place, tunnels in place, everything prepared for when the Iranian regime would pick up the phone and say go. In that moment, Hezbollah was meant to invade northern Israel, and all the other proxy militias were intended to join in and hopefully, in their eyes, destroy Israel. But again, the Gaza Strip was taken out of this network. Then Hezbollah was almost completely destroyed. I mean, the leadership is almost, the senior leadership is almost completely gone. The organization obviously still exists, and large parts of its weapon depot still exist. So estimates say that up to 80% was destroyed, but 20% of the hundreds of thousands of projectiles they had are still a lot and are still dangerous to Israel. But what Israel did and continues to do is not just hit Hezbollah, but Israel has been very focused on destroying all of these nodules in the network. So Israel has destroyed the infrastructure on the border. Israel destroyed the strategic weapon depots, the missiles, the anti-ship missiles I mentioned earlier, anti-aircraft launchers and missiles. And also in the last couple of days, again, Israel struck the border crossings between Lebanon and Syria that connected Lebanon to this larger network. And just yesterday evening, for example, there were reports that Israel struck within Syria and hit infrastructure meant to connect Syria to Lebanon and to Hezbollah. And a couple of days ago, we started to see these reports of this large rebel advance on Aleppo, capturing Aleppo in Syria. And this, again, we don't know. There's been allegations that Israel is behind this offensive. I don't think that's true. But what seems to be certain is that the timing is not a coincidence, and that the second that the rebels saw that the Assad regime, the Iranian regime, and Hezbollah were all distracted, they decided to strike. And this, again, is a huge blow for the Iranian network. This network that I mentioned had many routes crossing through central Syria, from the eastern part of Syria, from the desert to the western part where the coast is. And this rebel advance that goes from north to south, especially if it continues further south, will really cut through all of these routes and will deprive Iran even more of all of these connections that it built, all of the routes, the smuggling routes, and they may even threaten, in the end, if they capture Damascus and all of the surrounding areas, in the end it could even fell the Assad regime, which was really a central pillar in this whole operation that we've been describing so far. Another important development in the Syrian arena was the start of Israeli direct eliminations of Iranian officials, which is something that we haven't seen so far almost at all. So if you remember, a couple of months back, Israel struck in Damascus and hit several IRGC commanders, including very high, very senior IRGC commanders who were in Damascus. This caused this exchange of direct attacks by Iran on Israel and so forth. But the main important point is that the IRGC's senior leadership really has taken a hit by now. And again, something that was a bit underreported, I think, this rebel advance that we mentioned earlier that captured Aleppo, during this whole operation, another very senior IRGC officer in Syria was killed, and the Iranian regime acknowledged this. So the IRGC has lost a lot of senior commanders. Hezbollah has lost almost its entire leadership. Meanwhile, the US continues to hit the Houthis in the south. Maybe not enough, but Israel has also signaled and already carried out a huge operation that hit Houthi targets in Yemen, even though it's thousands of miles away. So Israel really has signaled a seriousness and a readiness to directly confront and really take apart, piece by piece, this whole network. So summing up, within the span of only a year, this axis of resistance has suffered defeat after defeat. It was hit again and again. And the work of 10 to 20 years has been destroyed in some instances, especially in Lebanon. And the Iranian regime must really be thinking, must really be rethinking what their future steps will be now. When Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced the ceasefire in Lebanon, he mentioned something that again was kind of underreported because it didn't really seem to fit into the overall picture. But I think the angle that we've been describing here, this focus on the Iranian axis of resistance, its proxy network, is really the important point here. Netanyahu said that the ceasefire in Lebanon would allow Israel to really turn its attention to Iran. And this is something that should worry the Iranian regime. and we will really see where all of this story continues to go in the coming months. If you want to follow all of these developments, read more reports and analyses, visit us at allisrael.com. Give us a like here on our YouTube channel, follow us here and on all the other social media channels.